This is a re-recording of the picture of Dorian Gray. I finished this almost exactly a week ago, I think, and filmed it, and then in the process of editing it, realized that it was not good audio quality. So here I am again. This was read for what is effectively my queer literature class, which is a fascinating class, but that's besides the point. It was read for that class, right? And so, Picture of Dorian Gray is super interesting, not only because of its representation and because of the decadence that is used, decadence being a movement that would have been present at this time in England in the late 19th century, but also for the fact that it was used in the trial against Dorian Gray. Used in the trial against Oscar Wilde. It was used to the effect of basically moralistic standards. There was a law, I don't remember the exact wording of the law, but basically a person could be punished and arrested for being gay. I believe I don't remember the exact wording, but effectively that was the plan for it, but because of the legal wording that was used, it became super vague. So things like this novel, right, end up fitting into the category, and the fact that Oscar Wilde even wrote this novel becomes used against him in the proceedings, because he is basically showing non-Victorian values in public, right, by having this novel published. But that's a whole other thing that is fascinating. It really is, but also terrible, because this novel then effectively ends Oscar Wilde, right? Which is a shame. Yeah, but on the novel itself, right, you have really three main characters, right? You have three really big characters. You have Dorian Gray, you have Basil, who is the painter, and then you have Lord Henry, who is really the major aristocrat here. And the big question that I think you first have to answer in this is, what is influence? And Lord Henry brings it up very early on. I think at like chapter 2 or even chapter 3, maybe at the latest. It's this idea that all influence is bad influence. And first you have to decide whether or not you think Lord Henry is being honest in saying that, or if he's just saying stuff to say stuff, right? And then you also have to think about, what does that actually mean? Is all influence bad influence? In Lord Henry saying that, is he influencing the young and impressionable Dorian Gray into thinking that all influence is bad influence, and therefore you can only trust people that admit that, or you can only trust yourself, and therefore you should only be selfish because you're the only person that you can trust? You have to answer all those questions pretty much immediately, right? And then you get into the actual portrait itself, right? And so you have to ask yourself the question, okay, is the portrait actually changing, or is the change all in the head of Dorian Gray while he's looking at it? And really, I think that ends up getting resolved pretty late on. I think chapter 14, which is when Basil gets to see the painting again after all these years, or see the portrait again after all these years, and he describes it as looking he, being Basil, describes it as being incredibly disgusting and heretical, and he can't tell what the portrait is supposed to be, or who he doesn't recognize the portrait at all. The only way that he can even identify it is because he can identify his own brushstrokes, right? So I think that gives way to the fact that the portrait is actually changing, which then leads us into this more horror-esque kind of gothic nature to the story, which certainly fits, I think, right? Because as talked about a couple different times previously with gothic natures and things, right, you're often being put into, it's either an incredibly strange situation or a situation where you should be able to find your way out, but nothing makes sense. And this really kind of falls into that second category of everything. You're supposed to be able to make sense of all of this as a character. All of this is supposed to make sense, but somehow it's not. You're familiar with everything, but somehow something is different, something's wrong, right? And so it really kind of falls into that kind of category of Gothic literature. Let's see. Anything else from that chapter that's really kind of important? Not particularly. You also have to deal with, this is slightly earlier, this is pretty much chapters 6 through 11. I believe it's 6 through 11, which is Sybil Vane, who is the first love of Dorian Gray. And this is also how Dorian Gray finds out that the picture somehow changes, right? Is because he goes out, he invites, first he basically just wanders the streets, finds this hellhole of a place that's a theater, because at this point in history, actors would have been like a step up, like one step above prostitution, effectively. But finds this theater in the middle of London, falls in love with one of the actresses, right? And so he effectively proposes. He doesn't do the whole ceremony proposing, but has effectively committed himself to Sybil Vane, who is this young actress. And he ends up bringing Basil and Lord Henry to go see Sybil perform, like two or three nights later. And Sybil is absolutely terrible. She's horrendous in the performance. And the two other men leave early because they can't stand watching it. And then Dorian Gray goes and confronts Sybil backstage, and basically gets in this argument on what reality is, right? And so I brought up this kind of metaphysical question about this idea of, to be art is to be beautiful and godlike, but the realization of doing art is somehow horrendous, right? And we see this initially. We kind of see the beginnings of this when Dorian is getting his portrait taken by Basil. Is that even though Basil is of money and he has his own area of some sort, he is still doing art, right? He is the one that is painting. And so he gets mistreated and he gets ignored. And as we move on later, he gets even more ignored. And then both Lord Henry and Dorian Gray stop referring to Basil by name. They start referring to him as the painter, because somehow the act of doing art makes you lesser. But to be art in the way that Dorian Gray was art, as described as art by Basil and by Lord Henry, and then the portrait of him, right? is somehow great, right? When Sybil lived in the world of theater and lived in the world of art, that made her incredibly attractive to Dorian, right? But as soon as there's a spider here, as soon as Sybil like seems to recognize that, like, oh, this isn't real. What's real is what's in front of me with Dorian. What's real is not the plays. As soon as she realizes that and her acting changes, then all of a sudden Dorian no longer loves her, because she is no longer art, right? She is no longer something that can be possessed, because now she is the artist. She recognized that she is an artist. And so Dorian Gray leaves her, crying and begging. And then that night she takes her own life. The portrait changes. And then there's a conversation between Lord Henry and Dorian Gray in which they talk more about her death. And initially, right, Dorian Gray is drawn to it because in of itself it is an artistic piece, right? That someone loves you so much that they're willing to take their own life when they have been rejected by you. And so Dorian Gray is drawn into that and wants to go talk to the mother and wants to admit his faults. But Lord Henry basically goes and says, no. It's only artistic if you look at it as artistic. If you look at her as trying to construct art, and once again, trying to be an artist, right? The person doing the art instead of being art, then this is no longer romantic. You'll get over her. I have box seats to tonight's play. And and then Sybil's dropped, right? Which certainly speaks to the treatment of women in this world of aristocracy, but also once again kind of brings up this point of, to be art is to somehow be beautiful and wonderful and worth something. But as soon as you are recognized as an artist, somehow that devalues you as a person, which is really, really fascinating. Then move on. Dorian kills Basil. He then brings in a police officer, a former police officer, where it is implied that they have had a sexual relationship in the past. There's nothing that is directly stated, but is implied. I believe that's chapter 16, 17 maybe. And so that's really the only forthright mention of any sort of sexual relations for the most part. So that's that. And then we have the murder of James Vane, who is Sybil Vane's older brother. And basically, it is considered that Dorian is too beautiful and too young looking to ever be guilty of a crime, no matter the odds that are stacked against him. Which kind of wraps around to this idea that has been going on throughout the entire novel of decadence, right? Of this evaluation between Victorian traditional values and decadent values, in which effectively decadent values are just the inverse of Victorian values, right? So if a Victorian society is based in biblical teachings and this idea that you have to be kind to others and you want a society that is nurturing and giving to the community, well, decadent values would be the opposite, so that you should be selfish, you should take in excess of what you want. What Victorian values also state is to be straight is to be normal, anything else is dangerous, and decadent values say queer relationships are the only way to live because the only way to be human. And so we get this wonderful dichotomy that Oscar Wilde keeps putting in here about, well, Victorian values aren't great, but also if we do just the exact opposite, it's not also good. You can also live in a terrible world in which the exact opposite of Victorian values are true. That's kind of decadence in a nutshell. But it's used in this case to show that the rest of the world thinks that Dorian Gray is so great and so wonderful because he still looks super young and super youthful and super naive. When in reality, when we look at his portrait, we know that he's done a horrendous mess of terrible things, and that his soul, his inner soul, is actually in complete turmoil and unrecognizable. But people don't realize that because his face and his body look so young, which then goes into that Victorian values thing. And then we get to really the final couple scenes, especially really the final 2 pages is really the most, I think, important to mention here, which is Dorian Gray attempting to kill the painting. Now, what you really have to ask yourself is, through clever use of pronoun usage, through this part of the novel, is what is Dorian actually trying to stab here? Because he keeps referring it to it as the painting, right? Whereas throughout everywhere else in the novel, it's the portrait. So now we have to analyze whether or not it is now called the painting because Oscar Wilde just used the word painting at this point, or whether because we're asked to think about this in an ambiguous way, right? And whether Dorian Gray attempts to stab the picture as in the portrait, and as discussed through the other Gothic horror elements of this, is somehow reflected back in stabbing himself, or does Dorian Gray attempt to stab the picture being his beautiful, wonderful face and body, right? Because that is the initial picture that is created by Basil all the way back in the beginning, the first 2 chapters. That is the picture that is created. And so we have to ask ourselves, is the stabbing an attempted stabbing of the portrait, and it's not like it's reflected back into him? Is it an actual stabbing of himself? Or does it not really matter because he ends up dead either way, right? You have to ask yourselves all this. And I think that really goes to show how your interpretation of that, I think, really shows your stance on the book, right? Because in my mind, right, I should say, it really stands on your book in the way that, and the question is Dorian Gray redeemable, right? It really kind of focuses your attention on that question, because Dorian Gray in this instance makes a choice, right? If he attempts to stab the painting, right, the painting being the last relic that Dorian Gray is guilty of anything, because if he gets rid of the painting, there is no evidence anywhere to show that he's guilty of anything. So is he stabbing the painting to get rid of evidence, or is he stabbing himself in an attempt to redeem all of his wrongdoings and show remorse for all his wrongdoings without admitting to his wrongdoings, right? Big question, right? And also brings up the question is the death of someone enough to retract all their wrongdoings in life, or do we just simply still have to live with it? Certainly, I think it doesn't, right? The act of death, whether to be to oneself or to anyone else, does not inherently gift and redeem anything, right? And that's the question you have to ask in Dorian Gray's mind. But also, the question being, is Dorian Gray attempting to get rid of all the last shreds of evidence, or is he attempting to try to redeem himself, right? Also, along these lines, you have to ask yourself about how you view the story, about the story as one big plot device. And I view it as being one of the darkest comedies ever written, right? Right along there with The Trial by Franz Kafka, because, right, you have this idea implanted the entire time that Dorian Gray is somehow influencing or creating the portrait in a new light, right? He is the one that is doing actions that are causing the painting or the portrait to become disfigured, to become wretched, right? And then he tries to do something good, right? Because in his mind, this entire time, he's been doing all these things because it's fun to watch the portrait change, and therefore he is creating art and yada 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 yada. And he seems to think that if he does the opposite, right, if he does good, well then somehow that will actually make the painting better, right? Because the painting is a representation of the soul. So if he does something good, the painting should get better. And so he tries this. Basically, he turns down the advances of a young girl, the name of Hattie, I believe is her name. Turns her down and attempt to try to do something good and not manipulate her. And he comes back and he discusses with Lord Henry. And Lord Henry says, well, you just did that out of your own self-preservation, and for your own righteousness. So you didn't actually do any good. And then he goes up and he looks at the painting. The painting has only gotten worse, right? Even though he's done a good thing, the painting has gotten worse. And then proceeds the whole thing of him stabbing, right? I view it as a dark comedy, as an incredibly dark comedy, because in any other light, in any other story, my cat's dying behind me. In any other story, right, the painting would get better because the action that he's done is correct, right? He's done the right thing, and therefore his soul should get better, and that, like, there should be some sort of redemption there in any other story. But in this story, it's just as bad, because he is told by Lord Henry that he's doing it for his own conscience and to get rid of his own guilt, right? And so this great twist of irony and expectation to the reader, which leads up to this whole thing of where we expect some sort of great, he's supposed to turn into this hero at the end, and everything's supposed to get better, but it only gets worse, right? It's just a huge ironic comedy about the world, which is really certainly how I view the book. Certainly then also you can just see this as a tragedy without taking the irony into account, right? And about how a reader would perceive the actions that are going on. If you just look at this, you can certainly just look at this as a tragedy if you don't try to incorporate how you expect Oscar Wilde to try to be playing on the expectations of an audience, right? So yeah, that's Picture of Dorian Gray. Wonderful novel. Fascinating all around. Really good. I would certainly read this again. Probably not soon, but I would certainly read this again. So pretty high up there. 7.5, I think. And it's a good rating for it. Yeah.